مشاهدينا الكرام، أهلا ومرحبا بكم في هذه الحلقة من مقابلة خاصة. يسعدنا أن نستضيف في حلقة اليوم المبعوث الأمريكي الخاص للسودان توم بيرييلو، وبنرحب بك معنا طبعا في قناتي العربية والحدث. Welcome with us on both our channels, Al Arabiya and Al Hadath. And you are here on a diplomatic tour that brought you from Riyadh to Cairo to Ankara to pursue the peace in Sudan and to build on the successes by the ALPS. Of course, there is some kind of success in opening the borders in Adri with Chad from Sudan. From Chad to Sudan, and the 3 corridors for the humanitarian aid. So do you have this question now, what about the sustainability of those aids? Do you have any commitments from both parties or both sides of the conflict in Sudan that this will be sustainable and it will not be stopped at any time and it will be increased as well?
Well, thank you for the question. It's so important that we're getting food and medicine into areas that haven't seen this for many, many months, where we have 1 million people facing starvation, as many as 20 million facing acute hunger and forced displacement from their homes. So we need to treat this as just the beginning. Not only do we need to sustain it, we need to expand it. We're seeing more emergency aid come in to the region to support the people of Sudan, but they're going to have to be able to move that on the key roads like the Adre axis, the Daba road. We're going to need to expand access in Sennar. We've also seen populations of tens of thousands in places like Kadugli that are cut off during the rains, even from the road. So we've had to start using airplanes in some cases. But the people of the world care about our brothers and sisters in Sudan, and we need to make sure that these minimum standards of food and medicine to those facing starvation is met. We call on both sides to continue the RSF and SAF to guarantee that safe access, including during the rainy season and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Despite the success in introducing aid and the respecting of civilians, but the Geneva talks, they failed into achieving the most crucial thing, which is the cessation of fire and the cessation of hostilities between the 2 parties of the conflict, partially due to not having the army or the government of Sudan representative, and I don't know what else was the reason behind that.
Well, we really do need to see greater political will from the RSF and the Army to end this war. We were disappointed that the Army chose not to send a delegation. We were able to work with them virtually, particularly with support from our Egyptian and Saudi counterparts, to be able to get progress on humanitarian access. We saw the Sudanese people overwhelmingly wanted their leaders to come to the talks and were disappointed that they didn't see more progress there. We know on the SAF side that there are some negative political actors making it harder for President Burhan to engage, particularly former regime officials and Islamists who need this war and the suffering of the Sudan people to try to have a backdoor into power. We know there's some war profiteers out there who profit from the suffering of the Sudanese people, but the vast majority of the Sudanese people want that peace. And you're right, we are not satisfied until we can get that cessation of hostilities. We'll continue to work with our regional partners in Africa and in the Gulf, as well as the United Nations and the African Union. We see the UN General Assembly as another opportunity to continue these efforts, but we need to find a cessation of hostilities, ideally before the rainy season ends.
Okay, the Saudi foreign minister stated in a press conference that Sudan crisis has been prolonged and that the Jeddah platform came out with positive understandings that addresses key points and understandings, but it has not been applied. Is the Geneva talks based entirely on the Jeddah Declaration, and what kind of difference do we have between both?
It is. You know, the partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia has been a crucial effort to try to end this war, but also to ensure that basic protection of civilian standards are met, even if the fighting continues. The vast majority of what we were doing in Switzerland with the Saudis and others was to try to implement Jeddah. That was something we heard a great deal from the Sudanese people and from the Sudanese armed forces. We would be able to make further progress if the army had come to the table, but we are continuing. The group that met in Switzerland meets every week. to look at the next steps we can take on humanitarian access and on protection of civilians. And ultimately, we, like the people of Sudan and certainly of the neighboring countries that have been taking in so many refugees as guests, we want to see this war over and see people able to return.
Yes, of course. Is there a meeting soon to complete the talks in Geneva, and the possibility of having the two, General Burhan and Hamidti, sitting on the one table? Is this possible?
Well, it's two different things. So first, on the question of the talks continuing, yes, we meet every Thursday as heads of delegation, along with a broader set of allies, including Arab League and IGAD and others. These negotiations are happening every day because of the urgency of how many millions of people are suffering inside. I think on the question of when we can bring the parties together, we don't yet have that commitment from the two sides. We want to see it, not just the United States, but a broader set of partners. So what we know is that in 2024, we have technology we didn't have before. So we don't always have to be in the same place to be negotiating the life-saving efforts that we're seeing now through Adre and Daba Road and elsewhere. So we're not going to wait in order to make that kind of progress for the Sudanese people. But what we know is most important is ultimately to bring the sides together to find an end to this war that's first and foremost a horrific humanitarian crisis for the Sudanese people, but it's also a threat to regional stability, and that's why I think we're seeing a broader set of partners around the world.
Yes, do you communicate directly with General al-Burhan, or do you have that through mediators, Egypt and Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, we do have lines of communication to President Burhan, not just for myself, but Secretary Blinken has spoken to him several times recently about the importance of opening up the Adre border, about the importance of coming to the talks. Certainly, our Saudi and Egyptian counterparts have long histories and relationships there. That's part of how we designed the group that was in Switzerland, along with the Emiratis and the Swiss and the UN and the African Union. And that's meant we can continue to negotiate with both sides, even when we're not physically in the same place. But I think those really important conversations about ending the war are best done in person, and we still hope that we'll have in-person mediation soon.
Okay, but what was the real reason behind the cancellation of the meeting between the U.S. and the delegation from the Sudanese government that was supposed to take place here in Egypt?
Well, I'll leave that to our hosts at the time, the Egyptian government, but it was a very important day because I was able to be with Secretary Blinken, meeting directly with President Sisi, and one of the things we appreciate about the Egyptian partnership in all of this is that it has been absolutely at the presidential level, the foreign minister, the director of intelligence who went on to visit Port Sudan. We know that Egypt has taken in 1 million Sudanese guests already, and that's really appreciated, just like other neighboring countries that have been taking on the millions of refugees. But we also know there's an eagerness not to have 1 million more, because we know that's not what the Sudanese people want and what the neighborhood needs. So the primary aspect of that trip was to strengthen the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Egypt, and we saw come out of that some of the most important results, I think, from Switzerland on humanitarian access. But ultimately, again, we want to see more progress on ending the war.
Okay, is there a possibility to end the war with a UN or international intervention in Sudan? And do you have any alternative plans in case the two parties fail to negotiate?
Well, we're certainly hearing more and more Sudanese people call for something like a civilian protection force. The UN's fact-finding mission last week made a proposal along those lines. We still believe the quickest and best solution is for the parties to come together and find a resolution that restores the civilian transition that the Sudanese people have already laid out as the future that they want. And we think that this needs to happen, again, urgently. As soon as the rainy season is done, we'll see the already horrific and violent situation likely escalate. So we need solutions now. We think those are best solutions coming from inside Sudan with support from those of us that are committed to the process. But we certainly hear, again, from the Sudanese people a rising set of voices that thinking about some sort of protection force from the UN or the AU could be on the table, but we're going to continue to push for mediation.
Okay, you spoke about external parties which pour the fire on oil in Sudan. Whom do you mean? And you have previously referred to Iran.
We do see a growing number of negative actors fueling this war. We do have concerns about the role of Iran. There's been a lot more engagement with Russia. We see foreign fighters from across the Sahel coming in on the RSF side. All of these are factors that don't tend to help push towards peace. In fact, we see a very negative potential for the fracturing of this from a two-sided war to a many-sided war. We think it's extremely important that Sudan remain a united and sovereign Sudan, and those factors that would come in to either push it towards a failed state or a more fractured state are extremely negative at this time. So it responds to the urgency of why we need to see this war resolved very soon and getting back on that track the Sudanese people want.
Okay, what about the countries supporting one of the two parties with weapons? And there are already accusations by the government of Sudan to some countries. Is it possible to impose sanctions on those countries?
It's possible. We know that we support an extension of the arms embargo for Darfur that already exists at the United Nations. We have issued sanctions related to that within our government and want to see greater accountability in the United Nations. For that, that's set to expire on September 12th, so there's a great deal of urgency around at least continuing that effort. We have not only sanctioned actors on both the Army and the RSF side for atrocities, but also companies, some based overseas, that have aided and abetted in those atrocities. So we think we do need to increase the costs on those that are fueling this war, and we need other actors to join that. But again, we want to see really the resolution and that restoration of the dream of the Sudanese people.
Okay, in his last visit to China, al-Burhan demanded the rapid support to be classified as a terrorist group, and do you agree with him?
I'm not familiar with what happened between President Burhan and the Chinese. I think we know that this war is one in which horrific atrocities have been committed, and that includes atrocities by the Rapid Support Forces. We have sanctioned individuals and companies related to those atrocities. We were pleased by the step the RSF took in Switzerland to commit to a code of conduct publicly. There was a set of Sudanese women experts who helped shape some of the components of that in a very powerful expression of the lived experience and really nightmare of Sudanese women right now and every day with the fears that they face. And there's no question that we need to see an end to those kinds of atrocities. And that includes daily shelling that doesn't take civilians into account, bombing from the air by the army. So we want to see an end to that, greater protection of civilians, and we think there were some steps made in Switzerland based on implementation of the Jeddah Declaration that was such an important result of the earlier work in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, al-Burhan concluded defense agreements in China. Are you worried about the direction of al-Burhan towards the east, to China and Russia?
Our primary fear is what's happening inside Sudan. We're seeing an incredible country of 50 million people, a diverse country with so much talent in such a key part of this region, really falling apart. And that's the most significant threat, certainly to the Sudanese people, but also to the entire region. So our primary focus right now is what stabilizes things inside the country. We know there are vast majority of the Sudanese people want to see that peaceful resolution of the conflict and the restoration of a single, unified, and sovereign Sudan that includes a sovereign and unified military under that civilian authority. We know there are negative actors both outside Sudan and inside, including some of the former regime officials that want to extend this war to find a backdoor into power. That's not what the Sudanese people want. And so our primary focus is that, what gets us to the outcome the Sudanese people are looking for. President Biden and Secretary Blinken have given me a significant mandate to focus on this 24 hours a day. We're pleased with the partnerships that we have of a growing number of actors that see the need to resolve this, and we hope to find a resolution soon. Okay,
there was previous talk about a Russian military base in Sudan. As far as you know, is this project still ongoing?
This has been discussed for many years and comes and goes. We think that overall it's something where more than anything else it suggests a lack of seriousness about trying to end the war. People are looking for ways to extend the war, or are they looking for ways to extend a peace? And I think right now, the sooner that we understand that the Sudanese people are asking their leaders to come to the table, get this resolved. This was a man-made war and a man-made famine. This famine wasn't created by some crop disease or some storm, some drought. This famine was created by two sides deciding to go to war and a power struggle with each other, who had frankly joined forces in order to overthrow the civilian transition. So we think it's time for those who created this war to end it. We think that is possible, and we think it's increasingly necessary.
Okay, the United States provided $1 billion to Sudan and its neighboring countries, and as you know and you've mentioned, Egypt had hosted 1 million or over 1 million displaced Sudanese people in addition to what it already has. Do you intend to increase the aid to Egypt, for instance?
Well, you know, the United States is proud to have spent over $1 billion supporting the humanitarian aid efforts for the Sudanese people. As you said, not just inside Sudan, but in the neighboring countries. We're so appreciative that so many neighbors have taken in millions of Sudanese refugees as guests. But we know how much the Sudanese want to return. And as you know from covering conflicts over the years, when you get into the second year of a conflict, people start to look at issues of childhood development, where the kid's going to go to school, people wanting to work. So even though we appreciate so much that people have been welcomed in to neighboring countries, it's different than having the dream of going home and raising your families the way you want to do that. So we will continue as the United States to be supportive of these aid efforts. We're glad to have more aid access flowing in each day and more aid coming into the region headed to Sudan. But we know what the Sudanese people want is to be home.
Okay, my final question is about the Rapid Forces, the Rapid Support RSF seeks to control al-Fashir in Darfur in preparation for the separation of Darfur. What will you do in that case?
Well, we certainly don't support the separation of Darfur or any partition within Sudan. We have called for the end of this siege on al-Fashir. And we worked for 4 weeks this summer on a ceasefire that ultimately did not come together for al-Fashir, but we will continue to work in that effort. We know that hundreds of thousands of people have suffered because of it. Some have moved on to Zamzam camp and other areas where we're trying to get food and medicine each day. But it's a horrific situation in al-Fashir as a humanitarian standpoint. And again, anyone who thinks that winning over that city is going to lead to partition, that's not where this war is headed. It's not where the resolution is headed.
Tom Perriello, the special envoy American envoy to Sudan. توم بيرييلو المبعوث الأمريكي الخاص للسودان، شكرا على هذه المقابلة وشكرا لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على حسن المتابعة وإلى اللقاء.